very fortunate to have Dr. Enzo Ferrante joining us today, who will be giving us a presentation on their paper, Gender Imbalance in Medical Imaging Datasets Produces Biased Classifiers for Computer-Aided Diagnoses. Dr. Ferrante completed his PhD in computer science at the University's Paris-Saclay and worked as a postdoctoral scholar at Imperial College London in the UK. He's been in Argentina since 2017, where he holds a research scientist position from the Argentina's National Research Council and a lecturer position at the Universidad Nacional del Litoral. He leads the machine learning for biomedical imaging computing research line in the Research Institute for Signal System and Computational Intelligence. We're very excited to have you, Dr. Ferrante. The way this usually works is we will be recording the session for the first 20 minutes or so, or 20, 30 minutes, however long the initial presentation goes. And then after that, we'll stop the recording and then we'll open up the discussion for questions from the audience to make this interactive and candid so that there's no recording of any of the discussions taking place. So feel free to say whatever you feel like saying. For the audience here, please feel free to post the questions in the chat as the talk goes on, and I'll try to monitor the chat and try to moderate the session afterwards. And after the talk, please feel free to turn your mic and camera on and just ask the speakers questions too. So with that, I'll turn the floor over to you, Dr. Ferrante.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm glad to be here back at Stanford, actually, because I was a visiting student at Stanford in 2014 while I was doing my PhD in France. I went to Stanford for 3 months to visit the CVGL group. And it's great to be back here now virtually, thanks to the pandemic. But yeah, I'm really happy. And I'm presenting this work that it's a joint work with some of my collaborators in Argentina, which is about, well, gender imbalance and medical imaging classifiers. So let's start. Oh, okay, there it is. Can you see the mouse pointer there?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So for those of you who are not familiar with the Argentinian geography, there's where we are. We are actually in the city of Santa Fe, which is not the capital of Argentina, and it's in the middle of the country. And we are part of the Argentinian National Research Council. We are in a pretty green city, actually. Yeah, this is our group, part of the lab, actually. This is the machine learning for biomedical image computing group, people working on this topic. And basically this paper here, it was made by mostly the first authors, Agostina Larrazábal and Nicolás Nieto, and also with the collaboration of Diego Milone and Victoria Peters. So let me start talking about how did we end up with the questions that motivated this work. So a couple of years ago, actually, we came across this article, which is from Londa Schivinger, actually a professor at Stanford University as well. And we saw this article, which the title is pretty impressive, and it says, AI can be sexist and racist. It's time to make it fair. So this article actually was, as I'm telling you, a bit impressive, and it was talking about one side of AI that we weren't aware of. So while reading this article, actually, this is a screenshot from my phone. For those who are familiar with Spanish, and you can read there, you will see that the first sentence says, ella es una investigadora, también escribe libros. And if you translate it in Google Translate at the time, you are getting this result. She is a researcher, which is correct, but then it says, he also writes books. And why was that? Well, it was because basically the algorithm has some kind of gender bias that was acquired from the data, right? Because here we were talking about a researcher, and whenever we started to talk about somebody who writes books, the algorithm thought, okay, it's a male. So this was impressive for me, actually, when I saw it. Other examples emerged at the time as well. This is a really interesting paper by the team of Timnit Gebru from Google. And they were showing, for example, some racial and gender bias in face classifiers, right? That if we look at the error rate of these classifiers, well, the maximum error rate was shown for dark female samples, right? So when compared with males, for example, or this kind of stuff. So we became aware of this fact, thanks to this article, of the fact that systems may learn some bias. And one of the things that the article of Londa was saying was related to the data sets used to, to train these systems, right? And for example, here she was talking about the famous ImageNet data set. And she, here in this picture, we can see basically the demography of the data set, where the images are coming from. And then these help us to understand basically how the systems may learn some kind of bias if they are trained with a particular data set that in this case was captured only from the North Hemisphere and mostly developed countries, right? So the reality this data set was representing, well, is the reality associated to these countries. But then if you want to use the same systems in other countries, it may happen that the system doesn't perform as well as it was performing before. So at the same time, also some studies from Londa were talking about the importance of incorporating sex and gender into all our processes of developing science, basically, right? This was a really nice review article that they published, in which actually they also talk about gender bias in AI systems. And so we, as I was telling you at the beginning, in our team, we work with medical images, with medical image computing. We develop methods based on machine learning to better understand and help doctors to understand medical images. So we had these three components, basically. Studies talking about fairness and bias in AI, studies about talking about the importance of incorporating the gender and sex dimension into the scientific process, and we have our team working on medical image computing. And so that was the way in which we arrived to this article that we published a couple of months ago in the PNAS journal, where we are trying to basically answer this question. What is the impact of gender unbalanced dataset in deep learning models that are used to perform medical image classification, in particular for computer-assisted diagnosis, right? And this is the question that motivated our work, and this is the way we arrived at this question. So now entering a little bit more into the problem we are trying to solve here. Well, as I was telling you, we are dealing with CAD systems, right? In a multi-label setting here, where we have an input image and we have a convolutional neural network. I assume most of you are familiar with this. And we basically have different pathologies, and we have a score for every one of these pathologies associated to whether or not the pathology is present in this image. This is the model that we are going to analyze, the behavior of this model. And so when we are talking about unbalanced data sets in the machine learning community, sometimes we refer, and most of the times actually, when we talk about unbalanced data set, we refer to unbalance in the target class. In the case of the disease classification problem, we would be talking about the pathology here. And we have like different number of patients for every pathology. That would be unbalanced in the target class. But this is not the kind of unbalance we are interested in this work. Here we are more interested in the unbalance in terms of what we call the protected attributes. Like it can be the gender or the age, attributes that actually are not going to be given to the system, but they characterize our population, right? And this is the type of imbalance in which we are interested here. What happens when we have less male than female patients and this kind of stuff. And why are we interested in this? Well, actually, at that time, I'm really active in the MICAI community, actually in the medical imaging computing community, and in particular in this MICAI community. And there, when I was reading the papers there, I realized at that time that many of the papers were not publishing demographic information related to the data. This is something I was feeling by looking at the papers and reading them, but then just some months ago, there was this interesting article by the group of Veronica Chepligina from the Netherlands, where they did a more systematic analysis of this factor. They look at the proceedings of the MICAI conference in 2018, and they choose the paper, 65 papers, which fulfill a specific criterion that they define, but basically they were dealing with CAD, computer-assisted diagnosis, right? Using macroscopic images like X-ray. And so in their analysis, they found something really interesting, and it was that only 12 papers, 12 of those papers, describe at least the age or sex of the patients used for the experiments. And also, they showed that from these 12 papers, there were only 3 papers that were evaluating and discussing the results with respect to these demographic attributes. So what this shows is basically that analyzing how the models, how our models perform with respect to the demographic groups is not common practice in our community. And this was something that I had in mind at the time, and I wanted to make aware the community that we need to be looking at these facts, because it may happen that our systems are biased towards specific groups, and in particular, depending on the gender, for example. So this was the motivation for this study. So in the study, what we did, it was basically to take 2 different data sets, the NIH data set, which has more than 100,000 images, and it's pretty balanced. Actually, you can see that almost half and half of the patients are male and female, balanced in terms of gender. And this dataset has labels for 14 different pathologies that may be or not present in the images. And the Shakespeare dataset, that it was actually released by Stanford University. And it has more than 200,000 images. And also, we can say that it's a balanced dataset. So with these datasets, what we tried to do was to recreate different type of unbalanced scenarios and analyze the behavior of the models and their disimbalances. From the Shakespeare dataset, I have to say we only use the frontal view images, and since this dataset also incorporated uncertainty labels, we consider these uncertain labels as negative labels. Like this in the paper, in the original Shakespeare paper, this is called the U0 approach, I think. And it was like the most conservative approach we could take for this task. And what we did, it was to evaluate the performance of 3 different models. Actually, we use the 3 different architectures, which are standard nowadays, and they were used to tackle this problem before. We are talking about the DenseNet, BreastNet, and InceptionV3 architecture. And why we did that? Well, because we wanted to see whether our conclusions are independent of the model we are using to perform classification, right? And so that's why we use 2 different data sets and 3 different architectures in the study. And we analyzed 2 different scenarios. So in the first scenario, we call the full imbalance scenario, we have our training set, which is defined by only male or only female patients, okay? And then, I mean, we train a system only using male patients or only using female patients. 100% of the patients are of the same gender. And then we test separately in male and female patients and see the performance of the model. This is the full unbalanced scenario. And then we have partial cases, right? When we have different percentages of female and male patients in our training data set. And then we test again on the same male and female patients. I have to say that the test set is, of course, we analyze the performance of the model only for male and only for female to understand how it behaves. And the number of training samples is fixed here, right? In all the cases, we use the same number of training samples. We repeated these experiments, and I mean, every one of these experiments was repeated 20 times, considering different training and test folds to observe the trends and perform statistical tests on these trends. We constructed these folds so that for every pathology, in our data set, we have the same number of male and female patients because we didn't want to have in one training data set more patients with, I don't know, pneumonia, and in another one, less patients with pneumonia. We wanted this factor to be out of discussion here. We wanted it to be balanced in that sense. But the imbalance was given by male and female. And we measured the area under the ROC curve for every model using the different test sets for male and female separately. Okay, the AOC indicator, is used in these problems to quantify the performance of the classifiers, and that's why we took it as the indicator here. And so this is the first scenario, the full imbalance experiment, where we have the males. Here M stands for male. And we train a model with this data, and then we perform what we call the direct prediction. We test the performance on the male patients. And then we perform cross prediction in the sense that we look at the females. And same in the other way. We train with females and we test in both of them. So what you are gonna see now here are these kind of box plots in which we represent the AOC for the 20 experiments in every case, right? And in this case, for example, we are testing on female-only patients, and in blue, we are seeing the boxes that corresponds to training with male-only patients, and in orange, you are seeing the box for training with female-only patients. And this was the difference here. You can observe a clear difference in performance between these two different models, and this was, for example, for pneumothorax. When you go to all the different pathologies, you will see that this is a trend that we observe in all the cases. In some cases, this is more pronounced, and some cases it's not non-significant, the difference. But in most of the cases where the difference is significant, we are observing that the performance of the model in female patients, when it was trained on female patients, is higher than when we train in male patients. This is something we could expect, but actually it wasn't shown before. And that's why we performed all these experiments, which were many experiments performed mostly by Nicolas and Agostina, to confirm this trend. And the same happened when we change here. And when we train in male patients, we test on male patients now, and you can see that the blue boxes that correspond to training with male patients show a better performance in this experiment for all the diseases, for all the pathologies, And the same happened when, so the results I was showing you there were for the NIH data set, but same tendency was observed for the Chexpert dataset using the DenseNet architecture, same for the ResNet architecture in the NIH dataset, same for the Chexpert and ResNet. I mean, all the combinations, we observed the same phenomenon. Sometimes there were more significant differences than in other times, but in general, the trend was confirmed. Same here with the Inception V3 architecture. Okay, so this was the first experiment that basically confirmed what we suspected at the beginning. But then we also performed a different experiment that was to analyze what happened if now we are not training with 100% data of male patients or 100% of female, but we start to have models that, given a fixed number of samples in our trained dataset, we mix 70%, for example, from male patients and 25% from female patients. And we test again in the two sets. And we do the same with 50-50, and we do the same with 25 and 75. Here, again, one important thing is that we are keeping a fixed number of training samples in all these cases, okay? The number of training samples and the proportion per disease was fixed. Okay, and so this was the result I was showing you before. And here, what I'm showing you is for some diseases where we had this difference in performance. Now we can analyze this kind of gradient of percentages of female patients in the dataset. And so let's take, for example, the atelectasis case. And what we are seeing here is on the x-axis, we have the percentage of female images in our training data set, okay? So in this case, we have, for example, 0% of female images. I mean, all of them are male, and we are testing on male patients. So we can see that the performance was pretty good when compared with the other configurations. And actually, if you look at the differences between training with 100% male or 50-50 for a fixed number of patients, there were no significant differences. However, when we started to check in the, to use more percentage of female images here, for the male test set, we started to see a decrease in performance, okay? And this is important. The same happened, so this was the cross prediction case that we were seeing here. So basically, when we were testing on the same data set, we didn't find, on the same gender, sorry, we didn't find significant differences, but when we moved to a different gender, we started to find significant differences between 50-50 and 100%. And the same, was confirmed when we were doing it for pneumothorax and other diseases as well, and for female patients as well. I mean, when we were testing on female, when we had 100% of female and 50%, the performance was more or less the same. There were no significant difference here. But when we look at the case where we were training with 0% females, then we found significant differences, okay? So this means basically that having a diverse data set matters. And this is what we call the cross prediction, and this is what we call the direct prediction. But so, and same for pneumothorax as well. When we presented this work some time ago, to our colleagues, some of them asked them, by looking at these results, okay, but so what do we have to do? We have to train a classifier per gender. And then we ask the patient, what's your gender, which is not something, this is something that is not a nice situation to ask somebody and then use one classifier or the other. Well, what we did was to say, okay, let's say we did another experiment that actually this experiment is not in the PNAS paper, but this is something we did afterwards. And here what we did was to say, okay, let's say we have 100 male patients and 100 female patients. So what is it better, to train one classifier only for male patients using this 100 and another classifier only for female patients using this 100, or to mix the 200 basically images and train a single classifier that we can use for all of them to make a more diverse data set and also to have more samples in the data set. And of course, as expected, the performance. Here you will see in orange the performance of the system that uses all the images, and in blue, the performance of the system that uses only the male images. And of course, you can observe that it's better to have a more diverse system where you don't ask people what's your gender to use the classifier, but you just take, if you have these two balanced data sets, you mix them and create a single classifier that independently of the gender will perform better. Here you can see the results when training only with male patients and with the mix of patients for them, and when we are testing on male patients here, and the same will happen when we train only with females or with all the images and we test with female patients. You will see that it's generally better to use all your data set. And this is clear because we are using more data, right? We are using more patients there. Okay, so I was asked to keep it short, the presentation, so that in case there are any questions or discussions. So this is mostly what we presented in the paper, and some takeaways that we can take from here. So the performance of our CAD systems should be audited at the group level, considering demographic attributes like gender, but not only gender, maybe also age or other different attributes. And this is important because these systems are approved by our regular, like FDA, or here in Argentina we have AIMI. And this is important that we perform this type of group level demographic performance tests, okay? Even in some cases like gender, we use, or age, where you say, okay, I'm not sure whether this will reflect something on the image that may affect the performance of the system. But anyways, this is important to be done. Because why? Because the CNNs are prone to learn features which are useful, for specific subgroups which are seen during training. But when we have a population shift in our test set, then this system that learns some features that were useful to classify male patients may not be the same features that we need in our CNN to classify female patients. So that's why this is important. And in this case of the images we were seeing now, well, we had anatomical differences in the images that may be clear and say to us, okay, yeah, I see that there are anatomical differences, so the features that my system learned may be more appropriate for one gender than the other. But these, sometimes we are not aware of these things. For example, there is this paper by Google Research, I think the group of, I think it was a paper in 2018, it was published in Nature Biomedical Engineering, I think, where they were showing that actually by looking at images of the retina, you can say the gender of the patient. And this is something that you may not expect, to predict the gender of the patient looking at an image of the retina. So it means that there are some cues in the retinal image which can tell the gender of the patient. And so if we don't care about these kind of studies that I'm saying here, and we don't look at the demographics of our data, and we train only with male patients, let's say, well, it may happen that our system, when testing on female patients, may have a decrease in performance, right? And that's why this is so important. Another thing that is important, and we try to motivate with our work, is that authors should report demographic information together with their medical image computing papers, and especially when releasing public data sets. Because there are many public data sets which are out there which do not include this type of information. Of course, here we are talking about anonymized images, but reporting this type of gender, ethnical features, or also sex, whatever, may help to perform this type of group level things. And actually we are now trying to perform a more systematic analysis of the medical imaging public data sets that you can download, which are usually associated with challenges. We are trying to see whether these data sets bring or not this information. We want to quantify that so that we can inform the community and say, okay, look, you are not releasing this information. This is important because we need to perform group level analysis like this ones. So one of these takeaways of this work is diversifying your data set is important, it's really important. But as we saw in the last week, in the AIMI symposium, in the great presentation made by Rachel Thomas, diversifying your data set is not enough. It's not enough to fight against bias in our systems, because sometimes the bias goes beyond the data. And I'm quoting, I mean, this is one of the limitations of our study, actually, that we acknowledge, that we only look at the data here. But there are more factors when considering these systems that need to be taken into account. And that's why I'm closing my presentation with this slide that I borrowed from Rachel's presentation, where she's quoting Timnit Gebru, and she's saying a lot of times people are talking about bias in the sense of equalizing performance across groups, basically what we did in our study. But they are not thinking about the underlying foundation, whether a task should exist in the first place, who creates it, who will deploy it, on which population, who owns the data, and how is it used. So I'm closing the presentation with this because I think the problem may go beyond the data, But well, here we are bringing these experiments to show the problem data, but we have to be aware of these things. So with this, muchas gracias. Thank you very much. And I open for questions.
Thank you very much for that great presentation and a great summary and giving us some extra data than what was included in the paper.